All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month as a zechus for refuah sheleimah of Kathy's sister, Donna Baker-Matson. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Brian and Melanie Levine, in honor of the entire share, with Hakaras HaTov to the share, Miraz HaShem, to learn together for many, many years to come. Let's read that. Let us begin. Today's daf is Yud 14. We are picking up in Miraz HaShem, actually right on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Beis. So as you remember again, yesterday we were introduced to the concept of Maimon Shloshton, which means the ability to go ahead and convey ownership, convey ownership from one party to another party in the presence of all of the interested parties. So again, remember the paradigmatic example we gave is either in the case of a pikadon, a deposit, or in the case, ultimately, again, of a halva, of a loan. So remember, again, Ruvain loans money to Shimon, and ultimately, again, wants to assign the debt to Levi. So if Ruvain and Shimon and Levi are standing together, Ruvain could say to Shimon, pay the debt back to Levi, and suddenly Levi becomes the owner of that debt. The Chiddush also is what? The Chiddush is that normally, again, in order to transfer something, you need some form of kinyan. The Chiddush of Maimon Shloshton is it works even without a formal kinyan. So what we started with yesterday, what we ended off with in yesterday's shir, was trying to figure out, why does this work? What's the svara to say that it works? So we literally left off last three words on the line on Yud Gimel Beis 13b. El Amar Rabashi says, I'll tell you why it works. This is fascinating. El Amar Rabashi, Bahi Hana, de Kamishtanya Le, Bein Milva Yishana Le Milva Chadasha, Gomer Umishabit Nafshe. So I will say, interestingly enough, Rabashi says, I'll tell you why it works. It works because this actually is beneficial for Shimon, for the borrower, or for Shimon the custodian, whichever it was. But we'll go with the borrower. Why? Because I will say, remember again, when Ruvain assigns the loan to Levi, essentially, again, this is transformed from an old loan to a new loan. Was there an old loan and a new loan? It's just the fact of that, right? Ruvain was the quote-unquote the old owner of the loan, the old creditor, and now Levi is the new creditor. That is benefit for Shimon. How so? Because I will say, if Shimon wants to go ahead and finagle for a bit more time to repay, he'll have a better chance of doing that with Levi, the new creditor, who just came on the scene, than with Shimon, the old creditor, who's been the holder of this debt for a longer amount of time. Because that represents a hana, a form of benefit to Shimon, Shimon is willing to essentially go ahead and go along with this. Look at Rashi, type Rashi. On Yudal Amud Aleph, Bahi Hana de Kamishtanya, Hai Milva Lagabe Hai Mimalva Yishana Lemalva Chadasha. So because this is beneficial to Shimon as well, he goes again from one creditor to another creditor. The assumption is he's going to have more finagleability. It's also a new word, right? More finagleability with the new creditor. So therefore, again, he's willing to commit himself to this process. So remember again, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, at the time of the loan, Shimon is willing to commit to assignment of the loan. So he's willing to commit to this. Why would he be willing? And even if he does not know who the loan is going to be assigned to, and even if the person to whom the loan is going to be assigned is not yet born, Shimon is willing to commit to this. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's actually beneficial to him. Because getting a new creditor potentially prolongs or extends the repayment window. In the zechus of that hana, he's going to be mishabed himself. So the Gemara says, that's fine, except the following. Amalei Huna, we'll say Yud Daled Amud Aleph, 14a, 3 lines down. Amalei Huna, Mar Bereid Rav Nechemia Rabashi. So here's the problem. Elamiata, Kigon Hani Debe Bar Al Yashav. Well, if that's the case, what happens if halacha l'maisa, you borrowed money from someone like the El Yashiv Mishpacha? So what happened? The Kafsi v'Shakli la'alter. They were known that halacha l'maisa, they never extended the deadline for a debt. Otherwise, once you owed them money, quite literally, they would tie you up and take the repayment immediately. And that's not a metaphor. That's actually like literal. So in other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is, well, what happens if the loan was assigned to a creditor like this? A creditor who it's known never extends the window for repayment, but in fact, exact repayment immediately. So you're going to say, in that case, again, the borrower doesn't commit himself for the assignment of the debt. Well, maybe you'll say, yeah, indeed, in that kind of case, so Shimon would not agree to assignment of the debt. We'll say, if that's the case, then what you've effectively done is, you've gone ahead and you've literally, again, made exceptions to the rule. In other words, also remember, whenever Chazal make a rule, so the whole strength of a rule is in its applicability in almost every circumstance. Are there going to be exceptions? There are exceptions to every single rule, absolutely. But Lamaisa, if you're telling me that the svara of Maimon Shlashtan is that a borrower is going to be okay with the assignment of the debt, because assignment of the debt provides him with more time to repay. Therefore, again, that logic is only going to work with an assignment where he can indeed finagle for an extended payment window. But the Lamaisa is going to be with someone who's more exacting, then Ma'amad Shlashtan is not going to work. So sometimes Ma'amad Shlashtan will work. Sometimes Ma'amad Shlashtan won't work. That doesn't make any sense. Ella Amar Mar Zutra. Therefore, I will say third option. Mar Zutra says, Hani Tlas Mili Shavyinhu Rabbanon Kihilcho Sabalo Taima. Now the rabbis say there are three rabbinic laws that the rabbis instituted as like a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So what does that mean? What's the beauty of a halacha l'Moshe Misinai? We know it's true, but what? We don't know why. So the Gemara says there are three rabbinic laws that the rabbis instituted that should be like a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. In that they're absolutely unequivocally true, but the reason for them is not immediately clear. What are the three? The chada ha. One is Ma'amad Shlashtan. So I'll say Ma'amad Shlashtan is halacha that essentially the Gemara is saying is Ma'amad Shlashtan works. Why does it work? I don't know. Chazal didn't tell us why it worked, but they told us it worked. That's number one. Number two, v'idach. Dom Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said name Shmuel. HaKosef kol nechasav liishto. But it's an interesting case. If a person writes over all of his property to his wife, right? So Ruvain is married to Rachel. Ruvain assigns his entire estate to his wife. Lo asa ela apitropia. Ultimately, again, he does not really go ahead and mean to convey ownership to her. Rather, what does he mean to do? To make her the executor of the estate. He doesn't mean to convey ownership. Rather, he means to give her control. Third halacha, v'idach tam Rav Chananya, hamasi isha libno gadol babayis kino. We'll say if you make a chasana for your adult son in a house, ultimately, again, you've conveyed ownership of that house to your son. So we'll say, so these are three rabbinic halachas, which ultimately, again, Chazal instituted as a halacha l'Moshe Misinai, meaning that they are true, they work, but Chazal did not tell us the reason why they worked. We'll say, if you take a quick look at Tosas, so Tosas says, Kilcha Sabalo Tam, and she does his Perish, he pays his Perish, Mashemo Liknos, Aval Tam Yesh Lama Tiknu Chachamim Amaymot Shlashtam. So we'll say, so just to be clear, Tosas says, don't think that these three halachos don't have a reason. Of course they have a reason. Right? Every rabbinic, will say, unlike the Torah, which could institute a chok, Chazal cannot institute chukim. Right? When Chazal institute a halacha, they have to go ahead and have a rationale for the institution of the halacha. What the Gemara is just pointing out over here is, Chazal over here didn't share it. They didn't share. For whatever the reason, they chose not to share. So Tosa says over here, of course there's a logic. He says, for example, Tiknu Mamad Shlashtan, Tiknu Shlo Yitzarech Litrach, V'lasos Kinyonim. Others will say, Chazal felt that in certain situations, it's actually in the best interest of all the parties involved to be able to affect a transaction without kinyanim. So I would say assignment of a debt or assignment of a pikadon, Chazal felt if you could create essentially like an expedited process for that, without kinyanim, it's absolutely beneficial to all the parties involved. The second case, hakosef nechasav liishto. I will say, why does it work? That if a person assigns all of his property to his wife does not become the owner. Rather, what is she? She's the apatropa, she's the executive. Why? So what's the logic there? Mishum delo shavik librei v'yariv lachrini v'derech lasos kin elalachlok lo kavod ulimno sapatropia. So I will say, it's not the normal derech of things for a person to cut his kids out of his estate, right, and to give everything to his wife. So therefore, again, when he quote-unquote assigns everything to his wife, what he's really doing is he's giving her the kavod of being in charge of the estate. She's the apotropis, but halacha l'maaseh, he does not mean to cut his kids out of this at all. Third thing, maseh isha libno kisha'ab maser komashi yeshlo min abayis samcha leboseh. What's the case over here? The case over here is where I'm making a chasana for my son. So we'll say, what do? I make a chasana in the house. And what do I do before the chasana? I clear out all of my stuff from the house. So I will say, so again, clearly by clearing out all of my stuff, what am I effectively doing? I'm giving over ownership to my son of this home after his chasana. I'm really fascinating at this. So therefore we'll say, it turns out, let's take a step back. What's the svara of Maimed Shlashtan? What's the svara? Chazal felt that there are certain situations for which a fast-tracked assignment is in the best interest of society. So create a mechanism where you could quickly assign debt, where you could quickly assign a pikadon without having to use kinyanim. Essentially, as long as you have all the interested parties present, you could quickly assign it right there. That's the logic. Chazal just chose to create this mechanism. And by the way, I forgot about one point. How are Chazal allowed to do this? How are they allowed to do this? So this Tosas didn't say, but Rashi did say, which is Hefker Beis Din Hefker. I will say, what's the concept of Hefker Beis Din Hefker? What's that concept? Beis Din has control over monetary law, right? Over the monetary operations of society. That power is vested in Beis Din. Hefker Beis Din Hefker. So therefore, again, essentially, Beis Din has the right to say when you need kinyanim and when you don't need kinyanim. They have the ability to assign money as they please. A similar concept to eminent domain, but a little bit different than our contemporary concept of eminent domain, because eminent domain really focuses much more on like the making a private property public for the greater use of the community. This is Hefker Beis Din Hefker is actually a little bit more expansive than that. So that's my Mishlashtan, right? It operates based on Hefker Beis Din Hefker. It's one of these three halachas that Chazal instituted like a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Incredible. Amalei Rav l'Rav Acha Bardala. So we'll say now a couple of interesting stories over here, really good stories. Not I got into stories, like halacha stories, but still good stories. Story is a story. Right, so we'll say, here we go. Amar le Rav Acha Bardala. So Rav said to Rav Acha Bardala, Kaba demorika isle gabach. Listen, I deposited with you a kav of saffron. Right? So Yehive leploni. So go ahead and I want you to give it to Ploni. Right? So this is Rav saying to Rav Acha Bardala, I have a kav of saffron that I deposited with you. Do me a favor, give it to Ruvain. Right? And what happened? So the Gemara says, so ba'apei kamin alecha telo hadranabi, and I'm saying this to you in the presence of Ruvain. So Rav says this to Rav Acha Bardala in the presence of Ruvain, and he says to Rav Acha Bardala, I'm saying this to you in the presence of Ruvain in order that I don't retract. Right? I don't want to retract. I don't want to retract my statement. So the Gemara says that's interesting. Michlal di boy hadirbe. So masi hadirbe. So I'll say that sounds like what Rav is saying is if I wanted to retract, I could retract. But a second, we'll say, what do we call this type of transaction? What do we call this? What? This is my mishlashtan. Right? Rav is assigning the interest of, right, is assigning this kav of saffron that is currently in the possession of Rav Acha Bardala, and he's assigning it to Ruvain. So this is my mishlashtan. We just said before the my mishlashtan, you can't, right, it's a valid assignment. Hachi kamar. Dvarim halalo lo nitnu lachazara. Then I will say what Rav meant to say was, since it's happening with my mishlashtan, therefore what? It cannot be retracted. So good. Just a real life the real life story of Maimon Shlashtan. Incredible. So the Gemara says, I ha'amarav chadazimna, but Rav already said this once. Rav huna amarav, manali biyadecha, tineo leploni b'maimon shlashtan kana. So I'll say, but one second, why do we need this story? Rav already said this once, right? Rav already said that if Reuben says to Shimon, I deposited a mana with you, I now want you to give it to Levi, and Reuven says this to Shimon in the presence of Levi, that ultimately Levi becomes the new owner of the mana. That's my mishlashtan. Why do you need it here? So the Gemara says, Imeahi havamina hani mili matan meruba. But say, if I would have just said the mana case, right, I would have said, you know what, a mana is a significant amount of money. So maybe, when does my mishlashtan work? When does it work? In the case of a significant transfer, a significant amount. However, I will say maybe a small gift. You could even transfer ownership, assign ownership, even not in the presence of the intended party. Kamash malano. Kamash malano will say, in halacha, you have two avenues of assignment, right? Two avenues of assignment, or two avenues of conveyance. A, right, your typical avenue, which is a kinyan. A kinyan, right? You want to acquire, we'll say again, remember, metaltlin, movable property, you acquire ultimately again through Mashiach, right? You could go, or chalipin, again, we'll discuss, but let me say again, you go ahead and you have movable property, so there are kinyanic mechanisms in order to go ahead and acquire ownership. That's avenue number one. But if you are going to use Maimon Shlashtan, I will say Maimon Shlashtan requires just that, the presence of all three interested parties together, whether the item being conveyed is valuable or not so valuable. Halacha l'maisa, Maimon Shlashtan requires all three parties present. Incredible. Well, it says, two dots, Yud Daled Amadala 14a. What's another great story? Hano Ginoi, David Chushbana Bahadi Adadi. We'll say they were a group of farmers, literally gardeners, right? Group gardeners. I will say they were all partners in a particular field. So what happened? They were doing an accounting at the end of the month, and they realized, Pash Chamesh Istari Zuze Gabi Chad Minayu. One of the gardeners, got 5 more zuzim than everyone else. Okay, again, I will say, not a case of theft or anything like that. He just in the division, I guess, of the produce, whatever else, one guy ended up getting 5 zuzim more than everyone else. Some relate, they said to the guy, we'll call him Ruvain, the gardener who got more, no problem, Yavinu nehele lemari ara. Listen, give that extra 5 zuz, give it to the landlord, and let it go towards rent. Good. I will say, they said this, ba'ape mari ara. The economy name. So we'll say they said this in front of the landlord. So we'll say, and now something interesting happens. So we'll say, remember again, the fact that they said it in front of the landlord, what does that make this case? What does that make this case? Maimon Shlashtan. Now, in addition to that, ultimately, again, the landlord also did a kinyan chalipin. Very interesting. It also did a kinyan chalipin. So it says, remember again, a kinyan chalipin is a flip act of acquisition. So generally, again, we'll both say the way that is affected is, let's say, party A gives party B an item, party B acquires the item, and in return, party A acquires something else, right? So again, we do this at a chasana all the time with a handkerchief, right? So again, we're not getting into the mechanisms of chalipin right now. So in this case, interestingly enough, the landlord acquired the 5 zuz in 2 ways. Number 1, Maimon Shlashtan. Number 2, a kinyan chalipin. Okay. The sof, azal avat chushbana, bein leil and afshay. So I will say, ultimately, again, afterwards, so the gardener went ahead and did his own private accounting. In other words, he was going through his own, right? He was doing a bank reconciliation. See, he was going through his finances, and he realized, lo pash kabe v'lo midi. Actually, he did not actually have any extra money. Right? It was actually a mistake. Asla Kamed Rav Nachman. So I'll say, comes before Rav Nachman. I'll say, by the way, before we go on, look at the profundity of that statement, I'll say. If you have your own Gemara, underline this statement. I'll say, what? Avad, Azal, Avad, Chushbina, Bein Dilei Linafshay. I'll say, what did the gardener do? He made a cheshbon nefesh. And I was, you know what the incredible thing about taking the time to do an inner accounting? I would say the lushness of a chushbana, he made an accounting, bein dilei l'nafshei. Let's say, so often in life, like we're so focused on what everyone else is doing. Right? You owe me this, you this, you that. Everyone else, right? The problem is always everyone else. Sometimes stop, right? And realize often, forget about the world, forget about everyone else for just a second. Avad chushbana bein dilei lenafshay. Make a cheshbon between yourself. Make an inner cheshbon about you, right? About you. What are you doing in life? What are you? And we'll say something amazing happens. Lo pash gabe v'lo midi. So we'll say lo pash gabe v'lo midi means there was nothing left over by him, and ultimately again v'lo midi and nothing. We'll say, by the way, can you imagine reaching such a level in life like this, where you do a cheshbon hanefesh and you realize you've satisfied all of your obligations, right? There's nothing outstanding by me. We'll say, one day to do a cheshbon hanefesh and say, you know what? I'm doing everything I need to be doing. I say, what a line. What a line. In this case, of course, it wasn't necessarily talking about the farmer's ruchnius, but rather, again, it was talking about his gashmius. So he did not have any extra money. I didn't have any extra money. Lo pashtei v'lo midi. Wow, what a line. So Aslek and Rav Nachman comes before Rav Nachman. Amar lei my avadacha. So we'll say, San comes before Rav Nachman. And we'll say, what's the problem? What's the problem? The problem is the farmer committed b'mayim shlashtan and for a king and chalipin, ultimately again to this 5 zuz. So he comes before Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, my avadacha, I don't know what I should do for you. Chadadam Rav Huna Amarav. So first of all, I'll say, number one, you have this yomai shlashtan. Right? You agreed to go ahead and give this money to the landlord, and you agreed b'mayim shlashtan. You're b'mayim shlashtan. Right? That's number one. V'od hakanuminach. Furthermore, the landlord did a chalipin. So Rav Nachman says to this farmer, I think you're on the hook for the 5 zuz. Amarli Rava said, no. Atu haimika amar lo yahavina. So was the farmer saying, I'm not paying? That's not what he's saying. What was he saying? He was saying, the leka gabayin. See, I will say, the farmer's not coming to Rav Nachman and saying he's not willing to pay. What is the farmer saying to Rav Nachman? What is he saying? I don't owe it. The whole thing was a mistake. I don't owe it. Amarle im kain kinyan b'tausu v'chol kinyan b'taus. You're right. Oh, so that's different. In other words, to back out of this transaction, you could not do. Once the transaction was solidified, both by kinyan and ma'amar shloshin, either one of those two would make it an irreversible transaction. But lamaisa, what the farmer is claiming over here is that halacha lamaisa, I don't owe the money. So okay, if it turns out he didn't owe the money, this is called a kinyan b'taus, a mistaken kinyan, and ultimately, again, a mistaken kinyan can be retracted. Okay, beautiful. Itmar, holech maralaploni shani chayivlo. So what's an interesting case here? Let's say, I say to Ruvain, go ahead and take this money to Shimon. I owe Shimon $1,000. Go ahead and take this money to Shimon. Okay? Let's say that's the case. Now we'll say we're transitioning out. This is not my mishlashtan anymore. Different kind of case. I borrowed $1,000 from Shimon. I tell Ruvain, go ahead and take this money to Shimon. So we'll say, now watch this. Amarav, chayv b'achriyus. So we'll say, now what's the shayla? When the money is being transferred, let's say as Ruvain's taking the money, he gets robbed, right? Or he loses the money. Who has responsibility for the money before it's reached the hands of the creditor? Right? So in other words, I'm sending the money with the shaliach. Who has responsibility? So Rav says, chayiv ba'achriyuso. Rav says, I, the borrower, right? The borrower, am chayiv ultimately again, am the achrayus of the money. Right? I am chayiv until it reaches the hands of Shimon. Rabbi said, now, interestingly enough, v'mbal lachzer eno chozer. Now here's what's interesting. Rav says, even though I am responsible for the money, look at Rashi. Rashi is almost right across to the right. Chayiv ha-mishaleach hazeh. So I, the mishaleach, right? Me, the borrower, I'm chayiv for the money, bachriyu. So im yansum yad shliach zeh. Right? So halacha l'maisa, I am chayiv. Ultimately, if anything happens to the money before it reaches the hands of Shimon, but I will say, interestingly enough, then balachzer eno chozer. If after giving the money to Ruvain, I say, Ruvain, you know what? Ruvain's a shliach. So Ruvain, you know what? Give it back to me. I can't take it back. Once I've given it to Ruvain for repayment to Shimon, I cannot take it back anymore. So we'll say that's the position of Rav. Shmuel says, no. Shmuel agrees with Rav, namely, that halacha l'maisa, when I give money to the shaliach, I am responsible for that money until it reaches the hands of the creditor of Ruvain. What Shmuel says is, mitoch shechai b'achriyuso im balach sar chozer. But Shmuel says, one second, if I'm going to be responsible for the money, then what does that mean? What does that mean? That I have the ability to take it back should I want to, right? So since I'm responsible for it, therefore, halacha l'maisa, I could take it back if I want to. I says the Gemara leima b'hakam miflagi. So say that they're arguing about the following point: the mar savra holich kischi dami, umar savra holich lav kischi dami. So we'll say, so b'pashtos, what are they arguing about? They're arguing about the power or the halachic impact of holich. When you tell a shaliach to go ahead and take money to repay a debt that you owe someone else, does the shaliach effectively acquire the money on behalf of the creditor or not? Shabbos say it sounds like Rav holds, right? Rav holds that holich kizchi, when you say take the money, so effectively again the shaliach acquires it on behalf of the creditor, and Shmuel says holich lav kizchi. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not it. The choli ama holich kizchi dami. In fact, everyone agrees that when you tell the shaliach to take the money, so telling him to take the money is like telling him to acquire it on behalf of the creditor. So what's the machlokes? So let's listen to this. Here's the machlokes. Mar savra lo arminan migo, or mar savra arminan migo. So we'll say, listen to this. One says you say amigo, and one says you don't say amigo. So we'll say, so look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, in general, when you tell an agent to go ahead and take money to the creditor, that's effectively telling the agent to acquire it on behalf of the creditor. Rashi says, So we'll say, so listen to this. So we'll say, so essentially, we have this interesting idea. So listen to how this plays out. Where the Gemara is holding right now is, the Gemara is assuming that when you go ahead and you tell a shaliach, right? I borrowed $1,000 from Ruvain. Now, I want to send the money with Shimon to repay Ruvain. So let's get ready for this. Saloch l'maisa, when I tell Shimon, holech manazu, or holech elef dollar zu, the Shimon, go ahead and take this money to Shimon. So we'll say effectively what happens, Shimon acquires the rights to the money. I will say, get ready for this. Even though Shimon acquires the rights to the money, I still have the arichas, the responsibility for the money, until ultimately it reaches Shimon. I will say, isn't that fascinating? So Shimon is the owner of the money. How is Shimon's ownership manifest? That if after giving the money to Ruvain, I decide, you know what, I don't want to pay him back yet, I can't get the money back from Ruvain. Right? That money belongs to Shimon. But I have achrayus, I have responsibility of that money until it reaches Shimon's hands. Shabbos says, so essentially the machlokes is like this. So Rav says, well, if you have achrayus, you should have the right to take the money back. That's the migo. Shmuel says, sorry, it's just the opposite. Rav says, even though I have achrayus, I can't take the money back. He doesn't hold to the migo. Shmuel holds to the migo. Once you have achrayus, of course you could take the money back. So I was saying incredible. So just want to point out where the Gemara is holding right now, just right in this moment, is two halachic principles we're establishing. Number one, holech kischi dami, which means that when you tell an agent to take money for repayment, the agent effectively acquires the money on behalf of the intended recipient, on behalf of the creditor. That's number one. Number two, so the shayla now is, number two, the other principle is that when you send money for repayment, you, the borrower, have responsibility for that money until it reaches the hands of the creditor. Those are the two halachic facts we're dealing with right now. What's the machlokes? The machlokes is once I hand that money over to a shaliach for repayment to the creditor, can I take the money back? So that's the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says no, Shmuel says yes. Beautiful. Let's go back there. So Tanya Kava say the Rav, we have a brisa that supports Rav. Holich mana leploni shani chayav lo. Right? I say to Ruvain, take the mana that I owe to Ploni for repayment. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Ortein mana l'ploni sheni chayiv lo. Holech mana l'ploni sheni chayiv lo. Tein mana l'ploni sheni chayiv lo. Holech mana l'ploni pikadon sheish la biyadi. Tein mana l'ploni pikadon sheish la biyadi. Chayiv b'achrius. So we're saying all these cases, just different formulations of a loan, repayment of a loan, or giving back of a pikadon, of a deposit. Ultimately, again, chayiv b'achriuso. When I go ahead and I give that money over to the shaliach to take back to Shimon, ultimately, again, I, the creditor, I, the borrower or the custodian, ultimately, again, am chayiv I am responsible for the item until it reaches the hands of Shimon. Then balachzar eino chozer. But ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, after giving it to Ruvain, I want to take the money back, I don't have the ability to do so. So we'll say, so it seems to support Rav on both levels. Number one, holich kischi, when you give something over to an agent for repayment, ultimately, again, the agent acquires it on behalf of the creditor. Number two, I retain responsibility over the item until it reaches the hands of the creditor. And number three, once I give it over to the shaliach, I can't take it back afterwards. Incredible. So the Gemara says, but once I give pikadon, in the case, I understand this in the case of a loan, but in the pikadon case, I will say, so remember again, let's say, Ruvain deposited an item with me. Now I'm giving it to Shimon to go ahead and give back to Ruvain. So now we just said before, I can't get the item back from Ruvain I can't get the item back from Shimon once I gave it back to him to give it back to Ruvain. But with the pikadon, why can't I say pikadon lemalei ein ritzona shehei pikdona biyadacher? We'll say, remember again, a deposit is different because you only deposit items with certain people who you trust. So why can't I say to Ruvain, give me back the item? Because Shimon would not want his item to be with you. He only wants his item to be with me. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Zera, kishoch sakafron. What's the case? So we'll say, the case is where, again, I am known as a liar. Right? I'm known as a liar. I'm known as an untrustworthy person. So therefore, again, Abba says, it's actually in the best interest of Ruvain to get the pikadon out of my possession. Okay? So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Rav Sheshes, another story. Rav Sheshes, Havele Asharta Disarbali B'mechuza. So we'll say, listen to this. Rav Sheshes had sold cloaks to a certain group of people. Right? And what happens with a certain individual? He had debt. So in other words, he sold the cloaks on credit. So therefore, someone in the city of Mechuza owed him money. Okay, owed Rav Sheshes money. Fine. So again, what happened? It turned out Rav Yosef Bar Chama was going to Mechuza. So Rav Sheshes says to him, do me a favor. When you're there, bring back my money. Bring back my debt. Okay, so the Gemara says, what happened? Azal Yavin alei. So sure enough, Rav Yosef went. He collected the debt. Amrilei nikni minach. So we'll say, now listen to this. So now what ended up happening over here is, so now the group, it sounds like it was a group, right? This group, so we'll say, so just to get the facts straight, right? So Rav Sheshes sold cloaks to a group of people in Mechuza. Sold it on credit. They owed him money. Rav Sheshes says, Rav Yosef, when you go to Mechuza, bring me back my money. Fine. Rav Yosef goes to Mechuza, goes to the group. I'm here to collect for Rav Sheshes. So the group gives Rav Yosef the money. So Rav Yosef now is the shaliach to bring the money back to Rav Sheshes. Now I will say, the group who gave Rav Yosef the money, they wanted to be freed from responsibility, right? What happens if something happens to the money on the way back? So what do they want to do? I will say, they wanted to do a kinyan, right? A kinyan chalipin. By doing a kinyan chalipin, they would essentially transfer ownership of the money, so to speak, to Rav Yosef. It's Rav Yosef. So Amar lahu in. Rav Yosef said, sure, no problem. I'll do a kinyan. L'sof ishtametle. But I will say, so he was able to defer until he was able to get out of Mechuza without having made the kinyan. So ki asa lagabe, when Rav Yosef finally came back to Rav Sheshes, gave him back his money, Amrle shapir avarata, shkoyach, right? So Rav Sheshes gave him a shkoyach, ultimately again for having avoided making the kinyan. Why? So the Gemara, Amrle shapir avarata, telo shavis nafshecha, eved love ishmalva. Because Rabbi say essentially said to him, remember again, the lova, Rabbi say the borrower, is ultimately again a slave, a servant to the lender. So Rabbi say again, had Rav Yosef made the kinyan, he effectively would have become responsible for the money, which essentially would have made him a borrower. So Rav Sheshes says to him, Shkoyach, that you did not make yourself a servant to the borrower, to the lender, sorry. Lishnachrina, we'll say another lashon, Shapri Avarata, Eved Lova Ishmalva. Okay, so we'll say again, so in the second version again, Shapri Avarata, Shkoyach, because everyone knows Eved Lova Ishmalva. Bottom line, I will say, interestingly enough, is you see over here, from the people in Mechuzah, it was in their best interest to go and do the kinyan. Why Abosai? Why do they want to do the kinyan? They didn't want to have arichas. But shkoyach to Rav Yosef, who avoided doing the kinyan and thereby taking on responsibility for himself. So we'll say, again, the story also illustrates all of the previously espoused principles. Number one, that essentially when you send money for repayment with a shaliach, so you, the borrower, retain responsibility over that money. That being said, once you give it to the shaliach, you can't take it back. Right? Why can't you take it back? Because we also paskin holich kischi dami. That when you say go ahead and take this on behalf of the creditor, essentially the shaliach acquires it on behalf of the creditor. So we'll say, so it's one of these interesting things that the shaliach acquires it on behalf of the creditor, but that acquisition is only strong enough to prevent the borrower from taking it back. But it's not strong enough to transfer responsibility of that money onto the creditor. Rather, responsibility remains with the borrower until the money reaches the creditor. Fascinating. But what's another story? Rav Achi bar Yoshia havele ispika the kaspa ben arda. So also Rav Achi bar Yoshia. Did I skip? Good. Let's say second to last line. Rav Achi bar Yoshia havele ispika the kaspa ben arda. So Rav Achi bar Yoshia had a silver utensil in Narda. Okay? So in other words, he owned the silver utensil. It was deposited in Narda. Okay, Amar base. Amar lehul Rab Dostai. This is a pretty wild story. He says to Rab Dostai B'yanai, Rab Yossi bar Kipar. Shabbos say so again. So just to get our names straight, right? Rav Achi is the one who has the silver utensil in Narda. He says to Rabbi Dostai bar Yanai and Rab Yossi bar Kipar, Bahadi da'asyu asu nehele. Do me a favor. When you go to Narda, bring back my silver utensil. Bring it back with you. Fine. Azul Yahavi Nehele. So I say, so what happens? So, no problem. So Rabbi Dostai, Rabbi Yossi bar Kipar go to Narda. They go to the guys who have Rabbi Achi's silver utensil, and they get it back. Amri lahu nikni minaychu. So the guys, right, the custodians, say to Rabbi Dostai and Rabbi Yossi, no problem, we want to do a kinyan with you. I was about to say, so they gave back the silver utensil, but what were they interested in? Being freed from any further responsibility. So they wanted to do a kinyan with these two rabbanim, transfer responsibility of the utensil onto these two rabbanim, and then they're done. So let's listen to this. Amri lahu lo. So both of the rabbanim, right, Rabbi Dostai and Rabbi Yossi, said, no, we're not doing a kinyan with you. In other words, because if we do a kinyan with you, then we're responsible ultimately again for the silver utensil. So they said, fine, you don't want to do a kinyan. Amri lahu ahadjun nehelim. If that's the case, right, so the custodians then said, so give it back. In other words, the custodians were not willing to give over the utensil to Rabbi Dostai and Rabbi Yossi bar Kipar if they still maintain responsibility for the item while in transit. So they said, you don't want to take responsibility, that's fine, give it back to us. Okay, so I say, watch this. Rabbi Dostai Rabbi Amr in. So Rabbi Dostai said, fine, you can have it back. Rabbi Yossi bar Kipar Amr lo. No, we're not giving it back. The halacha is that once the custodian gives back the item to be returned ultimately again to the owner, you don't give it back. Okay, so I say, here's where it gets interesting. Havu kametsarulei. So the custodians began to beat up Rabbi Yossi. Because again, he was unwilling to give it back. Amrlei chazi mar hechi ka'avid. So Rabbi Yossi says, so now remember, they weren't touching Rabbi Dostai. Why didn't they touch Rabbi Dostai? Why not? Because Rabbi Dostai said, fine, no problem, you want it back, we'll give it back. So Rabbi Yanai says, so Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Dostai, chazi mar hechi ka'avid, you see what they're doing to me? Amar lahu tav ramulei. So essentially, again, Rabbi Dostai, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Amar le chazi mar hechi ka'avid. So Rabbi says, so this is actually the custodians, look at Rashi. Amrulei, Rabbi Dostai, Chazu Mar Maikav, Delo Kaba Hadar Lon. So I will say, so the custodians say to Rabbi Dostai, you see what we're doing to your buddy? Because he refuses to return the object to us, to which Rabbi Dostai responds, Tav Ramulei. Good, he deserves it. He deserves it. I was supposed to look at Rashi, Tav Ramulei, Harbeoko, hit him harder. Lashon Mori, Lishon Achar, Tav Ramulei, Yafe Rayos Hamakos Halal. Okay, so we'll say Rayos Halal. So essentially, Rabbi Dostai says Shkoyach, right? He deserves it. Okay, so we'll say, so now, Ki Asu Lagabe. So we'll say, so now, so Rabbi Dostai and Rabbi Yossi come back Trabachi. Apparently without the, again, it sounds like without the silver utensil, although it's not immediately clear if they're with the utensil, without the utensil. So Kiyasul Gabe, so we'll say they come back Trabachi, Amrle Chazu Mar Lo Mistaya de Lo Sayon Ela Amr Lahu Nami Tav Ramule. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Dostai, you know what he did? Not only did he not help me when I was getting beaten up, but he said to the guys, Shkayach, hit him harder. So Amr Le Amai Tavid Hachi. So I will say, so Rabbi Achi said to Rabbi Dostai, why did you do this? So what was this great story? Amr Le, O son b'nei Adam. So I will say, essentially what Rabbi Dostai says to Rabbi Achi is, you should have seen these guys, right? You should have seen these guys, right? Literally, again, b'nei Adam hin Amma, they were ridiculously tall. Kolvan Amma, their turbans were tall. Medaber mechatzehen. Literally, again, they speak from like their stomach. In other words, we'll say their voices were very deep. Ushmosei mevuhalim, and they had the scariest names. Names like Arda, Pili Beresh. These are the kind of guys. Omrin, Kfosu Kofsin. When they say tie you up, you get tied up. Omrin, Harugo Hargin. If they give the order to execute you, you're dead. Ilu Hargas Dostai, tell me, had they killed me, mi nasan liyanai abba bar kamosi, would my father ever have a son like me? What I was supposed to say, Rabbi Dostai was saying, like literally, I felt I was in mortal danger. So Rabbi Achi asks him, Amar le, b'nei Adam halalu krovin l'malchus, are these people connected to the government? Amar le, hein. Rabbi Dostai says, yes. So not only are they tall, right? Not only do they have tall turbans, not only do they have deep voices, not only do they go ahead and have scary names, but right now only if they give the order to tie up, they get tied up, execute, they're close to the government as well. Amar lei, hein, yesh la, Amar lei, hein, yesh la susin upradim shatzmach, do they have horses and mules which run after them? Amar lei, hein, he said, yes. Amar lei, Rabbi Achi said, you know what? Ihachi shaper avanata. Rabbi Dostai, right, good move. I was about to say, essentially what happened over here is Rabbi Dostai realized that there was a sakana over here with these guys. Don't mess with these guys. Ultimately, again, he felt that Rabbi Yossi made a mistake in not giving back the object. So I will say, so therefore, again, Rabbi Dostai felt to save both of their lives, he had to go ahead and kind of play along with them. Obviously, again, he did not feel like he was putting Rabbi Yossi in mortal danger, but Lamaisi felt that he had to play along with them in order to save his life, in order to save both of their lives. Again, he felt, okay, so Rabbi Yossi was going to get beaten up a little bit. A little beating never hurt anyone, right? I shouldn't say that, right? So we'll say, so Lamaisi, again, a little beating wasn't going to kill him, but again, he felt that he had to play along with these individuals in order to go ahead and save their lives. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Achi went ahead and complied with him, or agreed with him. Good. An interesting story. Good. So I'll say, so Holech Mana Leploni. So I'll say, so now another case. Holech Mana Leploni. Halach Ubikshu V'lo Matzu. So I'll say another interesting case. Watch this. I say to Ruvain, take this mana and give it to Ploni. And I will say, now what happens? So Ruvain goes and tries to find. So I'm saying this. I say, Ruvain is my shaliach. Go ahead and take this mana and give it to Shimon. And I will say, what ends up happening? So Ruvain, the shaliach, can't find Shimon. And I will say, why can't he find him? Rashi says, Shemes. He's dead. Right? So Shimon died. So Shimon died. So Reuven therefore cannot find Shimon. So both say, so now what's the shayla? What do you do with the money in a situation like this? So here's the shayla. What do you do with the money in a situation like this? Says the Gemara, Tani Chada, Yaksurim Shaleach. So we'll say one opinion says, no problem, Reuven, bring the money back to me. So we'll say, so again, just to get the case straight, right? I am sending money with Reuven to be delivered to Shimon. Reuven goes, it then turns out that what happens? Reuven says, Shimon's dead. So what do we do with the money? So we'll say, so first opinion says, Tani Chada, Yaksurim Shaleach, no problem, just bring the money back to me. Right? Bring the money back to the Mishaleach. Second Bryce says, no. Give the money to the inheritors of Shimon. In other words, I had intended to convey the money to Shimon. Give the money to the inheritors of Shimon. So what's the machlokes? What are they arguing about? Demar savra holich kischi, umar savra holich lav kischi. So we'll say this is reminiscent of the previous machlokes. Maybe what they're arguing about is one opinion says holich is the equivalent of acquire on behalf of, and one opinion says holich is not the equivalent of acquire on behalf of. In other words, I will say when I say to Reuven the shaliach holich mana leploni, am I saying acquire it on behalf of Shimon or not? So one opinion says no, it's not like acquired on behalf, and therefore what? Right, Reuven did not acquire it on behalf of Shimon. When it turns out that Shimon is dead, the money should come back to me. Second opinion says no, holich kischi, that ultimately again Reuven acquired on behalf of Shimon. So even though it turns out now that Shimon is dead, who gets the money? Ultimately again, Shimon's heirs get the money. So the Gemara says, good. Amar of Abba Bar Mamel, no. The Kuli Ama holich lav kischi. So we'll say this is different than what we said before. In this version of the Gemara, everyone agrees holich is not kischi. When you tell a shaliach to go ahead and take something to an intended party, the shaliach does not acquire it on behalf of that party. V'lo kasha, habibari, habishchiv mira. So we'll say very interesting case over here. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Bibari, yachshulim shaliach tolech lav kischi dami, v'zelo sholchu el lemekabel v'lo liyarshav, habishchiv mira, tolech dei zachiho. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara suggests as follows. Everything depends on the mishach, the person sending the money. If the person sending the money is a bari, then ultimately again, then halacha l'maisa, the money comes back to him if Shimon is dead, because l'maisa again holich lav kischi. If, however, the mishach, the person sending the money is a shchiv mira, someone on his deathbed, so Rabbi will say, what's the halacha? Divrei shchiv mira kiksuvin v'chimsurin damu. A shchiv mira instantaneously transfers ownership, and therefore again, halacha l'maisa will go to Shimon's heirs. Rav Zvid says, no. Hava shchimira. Both cases ultimately again are dealing with the shchimira, where the sender, right? The sender is a shchimira. Hadi isin l'makal b'shas matamos. Hadi lesin l'makal b'shas matamos. So we'll say, what does it depend on? It's fascinating. So we'll say, in one case, where the shchimira said to the shaliach, take this money to Shimon. So we'll say, if Shimon was alive at the time of the conveyance, then ultimately again, then even though Shimon subsequently dies, the money goes to Shimon's heirs. However, I will say, what happens if Shimon was dead at the time of the conveyance? In other words, the Shchiv Meirah wants to convey a money to Shimon, thinking that Shimon is alive at the time of the conveyance, but in fact Shimon was already dead at the time of the conveyance. We'll say, in that case, what happens? Halach l'maisa, the mana goes back ultimately again to the shchimira. Incredible. Rapapa says, hava bari. No, that's correct what we said before. Both are talking about cases where ultimately again the sender, the mishaleach, ultimately again is a perfectly healthy individual. So what's going on over here? Hadimis mekabel b'chaye nosein, hadimis nosein b'chaye mekabel. Well, say interesting. Here, one case is talking about again where the Makabal, right, where the recipient, Shimon, died during the lifetime of the Nosein. Right? One is talking about where the Nosein died during the lifetime of the Makabal. Very interesting. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, the mis Nosein, la'achar shemasron l'shaliach meis, v'adayin Makabal chai. So if the sender died ultimately again during the lifetime of the recipient, and the recipient is still alive, Hilchach mishas misa hanosin zachaba makabel mishud the mitzvah kind divrei hameis va'afilu hayabari. So we'll say very interesting. So if halacha l'meisa, the sender died during the lifetime of the recipient, so once the sender dies, then what? We give the money to the recipient, or ultimately again to his heirs, because a mitzvah kind divrei hameis. There is a mitzvah to go ahead and fulfill the words of someone who has died. So I will say, sheleimah holich kischi tanoi. So I will say, let's take a step back. And maybe I will say, in the midst of this, what kind of emerges is the concept of holich kischi. I will say, when you tell a shaliach to go ahead, and take something to someone else, ultimately, again, is that the equivalent of zechi or not? I will say that we keep coming back to this fundamental machlokes. I send an object with Ruvain to be given to Shimon. What happens the moment I give that to Ruvain? Does Ruvain acquire that on behalf of Shimon or not? Do we say holich kisri or lav kisri? So the Gemara says, the truth is machlokes tanaim. We'll say, here we go. Tisanyo, holich mana laploni. So I say to Ruvain, take this mana to Shimon, and what happens? V'halech ubikshav v'lomatzo, and Ruvain tries to find Shimon, but cannot find him. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Yachsiru l'mishaleach. Ultimately, again, the money should go back to Ruvain. So that's the general halacha, right? So again, I send money with Ruvain to Shimon, and then what happens? Ruvain can't find Shimon, money comes back to me. Meisa mishaleach. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. What happens if now, right, the mishaleach, I die, right? In other words, let's say the person sending the money ultimately dies. The mishaleach dies. So now what do you do with the money? Rabbi Nasr, Rabbi Yaakov, Amru, yachsru liyoshim mishaleach. So that's what Rabbi Yaakov say. Ultimately, again, the money goes back to the heirs of the mishaleach. V'yesh omrim liyoshim mishin ishtahulo. And others say, no, it goes ultimately to the heirs of the person who the mishaleach sent to. So I will say, it's a fascinating case. In other words, I will say, so what the Gemara is taking for granted right now is as follows. If Mishaleach sends money with Ruvain to Shimon, okay? And then I will say, then what happens? They're unable to find Shimon. I will say, unable to find Shimon means Shimon's dead. So I will say, so what's the halacha? Money comes back ultimately again to Mishaleach. The machlokes case, I will say, is, right, Mishaleach sends money with Ruvain to Shimon, and then what happens? Mishaleach dies. So who gets the money back now? So I will say, this is the machlokes. So I will say, now watch this. This is actually going to be a four-way machlokes. So I will say, watch this. Rabbi Nasr Yaakov says, Yachshu Yoshem Mishaleach. Give it back to the heirs of the Mishaleach. Yesh Omrim liyarshem mishneshtachulo. The Yesh Omrim say ultimately again it goes to the heirs of the intended recipient. Right? Rabbi Huda Nasi Om Mishum Rabbi Yaakov Mishum Rabbi Meir Mitzvah L'Kaim Divrei Hameis. There is a mitzvah to uphold the words of the dead, which sounds like it goes to the heirs of Shimon. The Chum say Yachloku. The Chum say ultimately again you split it. So we're going to stop over here for today, kind of in the middle of this machlokes. We'll resolve this last case. So it turns out that at the end of the day, I will say, in the case where Mishaleach sends money with Ruvain to Shimon, and it turns out Mishaleach is dead, everyone agrees that the money goes back ultimately to Mishaleach. What's the machlokes case? The machlokes case is Mishaleach sends money with Ruvain to Shimon. Shimon dies, and then what? Now Ruvain dies also. Who gets the money in that case? Four-way machlokes. Resolution of that tomorrow. Shkoyach.